Modern Eater Network production. Hell yeah. Let's get this party hopping. No more milling around. Get ready to have a mash ton of fun. Here are your hosts, Andrew Moore and Jeff Tyler.
Hey, I'm Andrew Moore, and you're watching BeerCraft, Colorado Craft Beer Show. I'm here with my co-host Jeff Tyler from Spice Trade Brewing, and we are kicking off another month here at BeerCraft. So we've switched gears. We are moving from collaboration to sort of the state of the beer union,
yes,
as it were. So if you're in the beer industry, you're probably aware that April is the month of the Craft Brewers Conference. It's in Denver this year, so we're fortunate we don't have to travel very far. We've got a ton going on for the conference. Part of that, right, for us is we get to learn as brewers, as business owners, what's going on in craft beer across the country. And so today, joining us is Bart Watson from the Brewers Association, the man responsible for educating all of us about the future of craft beer.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, BeerCraft, Colorado's Craft Beer Show. We're live on Facebook. If you have any questions for us, you can message us directly on Facebook. We have a great resource with Bart in the house today, so please send us your questions. We're happy to bring them on the air and talk about them. We're live, as we are every Wednesday, from Studio Kitchen, Colorado, home of the Modern Eater Network. And BeerCraft, we talk about the culture, history, the people, and a bunch of other things that go into the world of craft beer. So today we're really digging into the numbers. We're digging into what is the state of the craft beer industry nationwide, and what's the state of the craft beer industry here in Colorado.
Yeah, and we've got a really cool show for you today and a really cool month for you coming up. So next week is Craft Brewers Conference. It kicks off on Monday, April 8th with a welcome reception, and we'll be doing a show live from Former Saint, which is a brand new restaurant.
Beautiful
bar restaurant down in the Hyatt downtown, right across the street from Craft Brewers Conference. And we're going to have all kinds of great people. It's going to be kind of a who's in town. Who can we trick into coming on the show?
Yeah, it's going to be great. Actually, I think if you're in the industry, come by, hang out, see what's going on. But even if you're not, if you're just a craft beer fan, it's an open invite for anybody to come by and hang out, watch a live taping of the show, and also ask your questions to these industry professionals. There's going to be a lot of really cool people there.
Yeah, we're excited. We've got Ale Sharpton, beer blogger Ale Sharpton is coming into town. Is going to be on the show. And so follow us on Facebook this week, because we'll be releasing more guests and we'll be having that happy hour. And again, if you're in the Denver area and you want to have some good beer and you want to meet some interesting people, come down to Former Saint. There's a lot going on for every brewery, it feels like. A list of events.
It's like GABF version 2. I think I was talking to someone about it. It's like it happens. I mean, GABF happens in Denver every year, so it's always like just a week of madness. And now CBC happens to happen in Denver, so it's just like that second week of madness throughout the year where everyone's doing events. There's tons of people in town, and it's just going to be kind of this whirlwind week in the beer community. Yeah, absolutely. We're doing some cool things at Intrepid. Wednesday, we've partnered up with 5 breweries total, and we're doing a bus loop from the convention center. Nice. That'll get you out to some breweries kind of south of town. So Co-Brew, us, Bear, and then Novel Strand and Strange Craft. So kind of a south downtown-ish kind of a bus loop on Wednesday. And then Thursday, I'm really excited. We're doing a brewer in residence dinner with Urban Farmer Denver down in the Oxford Hotel. So the executive chef Chris Starkus over there, who's been on the show actually, on the show in February. He cooked for us in the February show.
So he's put together an amazing sort of 5-course beer pairing menu that'll just be an option when you're there dining on Thursday. And I'll be there along with some other people from Intrepid and to kind of walk you through the food and the pairings. Chef Starkus will be there as well. So it should be a great way to kind of wind down your CBC on Thursday and the binge drinking with a little bit of elevated food.
Go out on a high note. Don't go out on a low note.
And then we'll all take a week off, and then I imagine Chris will send us emails that it's time to start putting in info for GABF.
Probably. That sounds about right.
Yeah,
we have a bunch going on too. Not a ton going on as far as events for CBC, But we're super busy over at Spice Trade right now, getting ready for spring and summer. I know it seems a little bit early for that. We're just starting to get some warm weather, but now's really the time where we're getting all that beer ready for you guys. So we have some awesome spring and summer releases coming May 1st. We got our Little Umbrella Mango Passion Fruit Wheat Beer, and then we have our Scarlet Giant, which is our collaboration with the Denver Botanic Gardens, and that was brewed with a wild yeast that we cultured off a hibiscus flower at the gardens. Hibiscus key lime sour, super drinkable. And then we're releasing mixed 12-packs for the first time this summer. So if you're going to a barbecue, you're going to a cookout, you're going camping, grab one of these things and bring it with you. It's going to have all 4 of our beers in it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I've had that Scarlet Giant. It's delicious.
It's a good one.
I'm also biased because it's such a cool story.
Yeah, I know. We both are suckers for good stories, but this is one of those times where like the story matches the beer, which doesn't always happen, but I love when it does.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool because we're learning more about this wild yeast the more we brew with it, because it's a little different than brewing with a traditional yeast. Kind of are figuring out the pitching rates and the temperature profile and all these other stressors. And we're getting this. It's crazy because we brew it with key lime, but we're starting to get these really cool key lime esters out in like day 2 and 3 of fermentation before we even put key lime in it. And I haven't noticed it before, and we're kind of picking it up this year based on some changes we made. So there's going to be this cool, like, layered key lime flavor in it this year.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to that. One of the things I like about CBC, GABF, events like this is you get all these people in from out of town. You get all this beer that, even us in Colorado with endless beer possibilities, it feels like we get to try all these breweries coming from the East Coast, West Coast, Pacific Northwest, the South. That we get to try, and there's a ton of cool events. Or just anywhere you go downtown, right, is going to have great tap lists that's sort of evocative of the whole country.
Right. And I like that a lot. We talked about it before the show started, but the beer community in Colorado is great. It's amazing. It's almost too good. And I think we kind of get stuck in our Colorado bubble a little bit. And it's nice to kind of break out of that bubble. And CBC is a great chance to kind of get that snapshot of what's going on in the U.S. and kind of to tie into getting that snapshot of what's happening in the U.S. Bart, I want to bring you on to talk a little bit about who you are. You work at the Brewers Association. We know who you are. We know what the Brewers Association does. But maybe for some of those who aren't in the industry or aren't quite familiar with what the BA is, can you kind of explain that a little bit for our viewers?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Brewers Association is a national not-for-profit trade association. We represent America's 7,000 plus small and independent brewers, and we really have 2 big roles: promote and protect. So I'm a little bit more on the protect side, on statistics and government affairs, but we work every day to ensure market access for small brewers, to provide them resources to better run their business. So again, I do a lot of the stats and numbers and business resource type things. But then we also have a promote side. So we're really trying to tell some of those amazing stories of the brewers. We run the website, craftbeer.com. We do some more consumer-facing things. We introduced the Independent Craft Brewer Seal to designate on packages who small and independent brewers are when you're, shopping at the store or looking at a menu in a on-premise. So, we do a whole range of things, run events, Great American Beer Festival, Craft Brewers Conference, but basically we try to be the go-to resource for anything for small and independent brewers, and I'm super lucky that I have the coolest economist job in the country,
seriously,
where I get to do economics, but all on beer. So.
Yeah, which is great, and I think it's really valuable too. A lot of times, like a lot of brewers are kind of like gut feel kind of people. There's some brewers that are definitely like super methodical, very scientific, but some people are just kind of gut feel, and I love being able to have access to like hard data that's well curated and put out thoughtfully to kind of paint a more accurate data-driven picture of the industry, right? So you're the chief economist at the Brewers Association, so that's a lot of what you do is kind of leading up to the data release that you just did yesterday, which is the annual kind of state of the industry.
Yep, state of the industry address.
Yeah,
yep.
So that just happened yesterday, so we're just breaking news here on Beercraft this week, just absolute cutting-edge data getting dropped. So I guess, we're going to get into the weeds. I think, strap on your pocket protectors. This one's going to get a little nerdy, but I guess from a high level point of view, let's kind of talk about the snapshot of what happened over 2018: growth, closings, openings, sales figures. What did it look like? How was it overall?
Sure, and I think it's a little bit more of a mixed, mature picture than it used to be. If we had done this 2 years ago, it was all things good. Breweries were opening, nobody was closing, the market was growing double digits. And what we saw last year is, I think, some signs of a more mature market out there. Craft brewing's been going on for 30 or 40 years now, and it's starting to become a bigger industry collectively, even if it's made up of pretty small companies. So last year we saw 4% growth for craft brewers around the country. That's not the slowest ever. We had periods in the late 90s, early 2000s where it was slower, but that's certainly, we continue to see a deceleration even if the market's growing. Dollar sales grew a little bit stronger, partly because, we're seeing those sales shift a little bit more to tap rooms and places where it tends to be, on average, having a little bit higher retail margin. We saw openings still over 1,000. Wasn't quite a record year, but we'll see as we revise that number. It may be the most openings we've ever seen, so almost 1,050 total openings. And we also saw closings go up a little bit. So we counted 219 closings last year. That's the most that we've ever seen in absolute terms, but as a percentage is still pretty low. So only about 3% of the breweries in the country closed. What other stats did we have? Oh, one of the things I think is the coolest is the jobs number. We saw, craft brewers now employ directly, full-time and part-time, 150,000 people. That's one of the best parts of this story is that, these are businesses and they're job-creating businesses. So that was up about 15,000 versus the year before. There's lots of places we can dive into that more deep. But, kind of the overall picture was one of growth, slowing growth, but still a lot of activity, particularly in that long tail of small brewers interested in opening and, opening in their communities.
Yeah. And it should be said, too, that this is craft beer, right?
Yep.
So there's kind of the overall beer market, and then there's a small segment of that beer market. I think it's about 13%. Is that right?
Yep, 13.2 if we're gonna get
Let's
into
do
decimals.
it. Let's get in decimals.
Yeah.
Tenth of a place, significant figures. I like it. So we have 13.2% of the United States craft beer market, the United States beer market is considered craft beer. So what is craft beer?
Yeah, so at the Brewers Association, we use a definition about the brewery, not about the beer. Small and independent, and a brewer. So small, less than 6 million barrels. That may seem big, versus a local brew pub, but that's about 3% of the total U.S. beer market. That encompasses 99% of the breweries in the country. Independent means you're less than 25% owned by another beverage alcohol company that is not itself a craft brewer, so you can't be owned by a big multinational corporation. And then brewer, you got to make beer. There's a lot of people out there who are making things that are like beer, maybe have a brewer's license. But if you only make flavored malt beverages or hard seltzer, we don't include you in our data set. You got to make at least something that the average beer drinker would think of as beer.
If you make, let's say you make beer, but you also make hard seltzer or some other fermented beverage that's not classified as beer, does that still get wrapped up into the data as long as it's not like 100% of your sales?
Yep, so we would count that little bit of beer. So, if Spice Trade, decided to roll out its line of hard seltzers and they blow up and they're the biggest hard seltzer in the country, we wouldn't count that product, but we would still count the beer that Spice Trade is making. So we're measuring in our market numbers the beer made by small and independent brewers. Okay. And you're right to point out that this is different than the overall beer market since there's very different trends in the overall beer market, which had a tough year in 2018.
Right. Yeah, because sales are actually down in the overall beer market despite craft beer kind of still seeing some growth.
Yeah, this continues a trend we've seen in the last few years where the overall beer market has really had some challenges. It has some tough competition from wine and spirit. It has some demographic, some economic challenges. But over the last decade, we've really seen the high end of beer be the only place that there's growth. So, craft brewers, imports, some other premium plus products, which that's a very beer industry term. So, premium is what the middle of the beer market is, kind of your big brands. Premium plus would be things that are priced above that you wouldn't put in craft. So those are the parts that are growing, and basically everything else within beer is losing volume. We've seen American lager and light lager really just, lose volume hand over fist the last few years, and, it's been a real challenge.
Yeah, and that's something I think a lot of brewers often talk about when they start thinking about kind of the future of the industry. It's like, are we building an empire on a shrinking island, right? Is craft beer going to continue to go, or is beer going to continue to go down like it's been doing since 2008, 2009?
Yeah, I think it's hard to see.
That?
I think it's hard to see in the short term, any reversals of these declines. I mean, some of it's demographic. We as a country are getting older, and as people get older, they tend to drink less beer. Some of it is corporate strategy. Anheuser-Busch InBev and Miller Coors are making more money than they've ever made before. They've chosen to grow profits at the cost of losing volume. So, if they reined in price increases, you could see different stuff, but that's a choice they're making. Some of it's just consumer preferences. We're seeing a generation that, drinks beer, wine, and spirits in a different mix, and particularly spirits have won and beer has lost. So, I don't think we're going to see it change anytime soon. Certainly at the Brewers Association, we're pretty conscious to try to build beer as a whole, as well as promote our small and independent members. So, we try to adopt the differentiate, don't denigrate. We can build all beer, but also build, craft, that portion even more so.
Yeah. And that kind of feeds into to think, we're kind of breaking this down and getting more granular as we go. We're talking about the U.S. beer market, and then we're talking about the craft beer market. And now within the craft beer market, there's different subsets of brewery sizes, right? And I think it's definitely worthwhile to talk about those different subsegments in a little bit of detail because they're vastly different business models, they're vastly different business sizes, and growth is affecting them on a different level, right? So you kind of have your regional breweries, you have your micro breweries, and you have your brew pubs. Are those kind of the three main categories?
Yeah, those are the three market categories we use. You could probably break it down even further, but we think that's a good kind of starting point for thinking about the chunks within this small brewing industry. So, regional craft brewers are production breweries. We cap that at 15,000 barrels, or, that's the bottom line. And those are typically going to be breweries that distribute, they're selling through grocery stores or convenience. They're going to cover a wider geographic region. Some of them cover the nation, some of them are still in one state. But they're packaging and distribution breweries. Microbreweries are the production breweries that are smaller than those. They're going to be much more locally focused. Often they're going to have a heavy taproom component. But they're still a production brewery, and they're still not focused on that restaurant piece. And then brew pubs are the brewery restaurants. So a significant chunk is being sold on site, but you also have that food piece. And that we do that partly for resource creation as well. I mean, brew pubs are going to have a very different set of regulatory challenges, business challenges, staffing challenges. I mean, finding chefs in today's environment is going to be an equally big challenge as brewing the beer. So those are kind of the big three pieces we see. And you're right to say that the market is very different for those. Regionals are probably the most challenged right now. That's where there's competitiveness. There's lots of beer on the shelf. There's lots of beer on tap. And, they're competing in both directions. They're competing with all those small, local, nimble brewers. Yeah. But they're also competing with the world's largest brewers who have enormous scale, who can acquire breweries, who can scale them up. Microbreweries are probably the pocket where we see the most growth. That's something that people are really excited about, A, supporting their local brewer, but B, going to their local tap room. And so that's a place in the market where we're really seeing the most growth at the moment. Brew pubs are also doing fairly well, but that concept has certainly grown more slowly in recent years as people have shifted toward the microbrewery and the microbrewery tasting room. And I think it speaks to some of the challenges of running a brew pub. Yeah. I always say brew pub's three businesses in one. It's a brewery, it's a restaurant, it's the synergies between the two. And if you don't get all three right, you're going to go out of business. So, we've seen a lot of people say, I don't need that kitchen piece. That's a challenge. I can bring in food trucks. I can partner with somebody. And so microbreweries have really been the driver of growth. And last year in that overall craft growth, we saw microbreweries provide about 80% of that growth.
Wow. Yeah. So they're really driving that growth number if they're providing 80% of it.
Yeah, and it's a real mix of packaging and distribution, and then that taproom piece. We saw at the brewery sales grow very sharply last year. It was about 40% of overall craft growth was happening, over the bar directly at breweries, brew pubs, microbreweries. So that's where we see a lot of the dynamism in the industry is at the small, locally focused. You control your own taps. You don't have to compete with all those other breweries that are distributing kegs around town. And luckily, the beer lover's excited about that. So it's a match between business model and consumer demand, which that's where you get growth.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've been wondering. I think as we get increasingly more breweries, and especially for the market in Colorado, I think it's probably safe to say, you guys can disagree, that
I will.
The beer. I mean, making good beer now in Colorado just gets you a seat at the table, and being successful is becoming more and more akin, I think, to being successful in a restaurant or a brew pub setting where it's about the experience and the environment. It's harder, not to say that it can't be done, but it's harder to plaster your walls with used grain bags and put a couple of barrels in a room and call it a tap room than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that too is specific to our geography, right? We're in the state of Colorado. It's one of the top states in the country for craft beer. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of breweries here, and if you're going to try to open up a small microbrewery without something extra, without a differentiator, without an experiential differentiator, a product differentiator, an educational differentiator, or something like that, it's hard to drive customers to your location. It's more like restaurants. Say you think about restaurants, location. That's obviously really important for breweries now too, because you're focusing so much of your revenue stream on the tap room versus, I remember 10 years ago before I moved out here, when I was living in Boston, there was a couple breweries that opened up in these industrial areas. You had to drive super far to get them, and they were packed all the time.
Right.
People didn't mind having to travel for it because that at the time that was it, and it was really unique. You get to go to this industrial area where manufacturing's happening. It's a cool experience, right? And I think that has kind of waned a little bit. It's not quite as important or as
well. Yeah, I mean now I feel like in Colorado, people drive by 10 breweries on the way to your brewery in the back of the industrial complex, and so the model now partly I think because the margin in tap rooms is historically so much better. With large scale distribution, I mean, it just keeps getting chipped away at, and apart from a few exceptions, right? The shelf space is sort of a fixed entity, right? I mean, Colorado's a little different now that you can distribute that. Now that the grocery stores can take beer, we created shelf space where previously there wasn't. But in general, right, it's kind of a fixed quantity.
Yeah, and I think the grocery store aspect too is really only helpful to those probably 15,000 barrel plus breweries. Maybe, I mean, there's probably some on the just underneath that, but there's a certain level of production and a certain level. You really have to be with the distributor if you're going to be in those grocery stores, and it really cuts out everyone who's self-distributing, which is. It makes it tough for you to jump up to that next category when so much of the market has just been moved into this area that you no longer have access to. It's a big distribution challenge.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's going to change the market here in Colorado, and that we're going to see a different set of breweries being sold in those grocery stores who are used to dealing with larger players, dealing with distributors, not dealing with self-distribution than you saw in independent liquor stores where, I mean, that's a small business. They're used to calling on other small businesses and dealing with other small businesses. So that's totally going to shift the market. And, to jump back to something you said before, you picked one of my favorite buzzwords, differentiation, differentiator. I mean, I really think that's the key in a market like Colorado where, the things – we're so lucky here. There's so many breweries,
yeah, we really are.
but that creates a challenge for the breweries themselves because you are going to drive by 10 as you go. So why are you going to stop at that one? Why are they driving by those 10 to come to yours? That's really what every brewery has to think about. And beer it probably isn't enough because of the approximately 400 breweries in Colorado. Most of them are making great beer now. Right. The level of beer education is high. The production levels are high. So, beer is going to be one piece, but you got to have other reasons why they're going to pick your brand on the shelf or come to your tap room to drink it and get that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it's getting shifted a little, which is unfortunate because it's craft beer. The word craft is in the name, but it's kind of getting shifted more to a little bit of a commodity, I think. Like we're starting to see that as we get into the grocery stores, and I think it's going to start to increase a little bit more. You think about other beverages like coconut water or kombucha or iced coffee that you see kind of as these more commodity products that used to be craft products that are kind of moving in that direction. So I think a lot is going to change because of the grocery store bill, and we're not the only state that has it. It's pretty common around the U.S. I grew up in New York, and that's just par for the course with what I'm used to. I don't think I really understood what was going on with it before it happened here, though. Kind of the nuances of it.
Yeah, in many ways, we were the exception here in Colorado, not the rule. Most places, you can buy at those scale chain retailers. So, it is going to be interesting to see how it changes. I want to push back a little bit on the idea that craft's becoming commoditized. I think there might be parts of craft that's happening, but think about all the things that you're willing to pay a little bit more for in life because they're better. And I think there's still plenty of opportunity within craft. I mean, we have 13% of the market by volume, more like a quarter in dollar sales, but there's still a lot of the market left, and there's still, I think, a lot of high-end space to explore. I mean, think of all the people in Colorado who are willing to, search out that special beer from that special brewery, that are willing to pay a little bit more for something they know is great. I think there's still a lot of run room to make amazing beer, to do something a little bit different, to do something special, to use those local ingredients, use those crazy wild yeast to tell a story and really stand out in that world that, yeah, there's a lot of craft, but that doesn't mean it has to all be commodified. And we all have products like that. I mean, the coffee that we drink every day isn't the same as the one you're willing to pay for on a special occasion. And, craft has opportunity, I think, still to really, have brands that stand out and people are willing to pay more for and are special.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that differentiating factor, right, where that can be kind of a preventative measure for commoditization, right? Having it still be a local product, an interesting product, something that adds value to kind of prevent it from becoming a commodity like larger macro beer is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah. And I want to talk about growth. I want to kind of jump back to some of the numbers we were talking about earlier. We do a whole series of shows, I feel like, on grocery stores and distribution. But I had some questions about growth and thinking about 80% of the growth coming from kind of the microbrewery sector. And one of those questions is there good growth and not as good growth, right? So reading some of the numbers that are coming out, it's like, well, a huge amount of the growth that occurred in the microbrewery sector is from microbreweries who opened, as opposed to pre-existing microbreweries who got a lot bigger. And is that all growth is good growth, or is there some warning or message there that we can take away?
I think it depends on whether you look at this at the brewery level or the category level. If you're the brewery, and even then, maybe not all growth is good growth, because if it's not sustainable and it leads you down a path toward investments that aren't a good idea, it might be. We saw that a few years ago with a lot of breweries who expanded, they grew their distribution, and then they got to a lot of places where they really shouldn't be. And once the market got more competitive and those places filled in with breweries, they really had to retreat back to other locations. So it's a great question. I think it's one that we're going to have to see how much are those new breweries. Are they building the market? Are they adding demand? Are they doing something different and growing the total pie for craft brewers versus taking a slice out of what would have been somebody else's growth? And, if there's one big challenge, there's still a lot of growth out there. Craft grew about 1 million barrels. That's about 0.5% of the total U.S. beer market, which is it's hard to even conceptualize how big the U.S. beer market is.
I'm in the beer industry, and I still am left wondering who is drinking all of this beer.
So much beer.
I'm doing my part, but wow, yeah.
But you think about how much growth we got. We got 0.5% of this huge market, 1 million barrels. That's great as a category. That's a ton of growth. But it's now getting sliced up 7,000 ways. And that's where the challenge lies, that there are going to be breweries and businesses based on the way they invested, based on the way they built their model, that they need more growth than that. That to make it sustainable, they had to grow more. And that's where the challenge is. And I think it's hard to know exactly what those new breweries are doing. Are they bringing something new in? Are they inviting a new community in? Are they coming into a new place that had demand? Versus are they just slicing up the pie a little bit more in a particular place? And the real answer, it's probably mixed. Some of them are going into neighborhoods where there's already 4 or 5 breweries, and all those rest of the breweries are going to see their sales go down a little bit from that new brewery. And some of them are going places where people are super excited. They had to drive half an hour before to get a brewery. Now they can get one around the corner, and that's going to be new demand, and it's going to grow the whole pie.
Yeah.
I think we kind of touched on this dirty word, saturation. As far as growth potential goes. You hear it thrown around a lot in the beer community. I think nationwide is a much different story than it is in Colorado, but kind of focusing on Colorado for a minute as far as saturation goes. People throw it around like, oh, this is saturated, that's saturated. What, from an economics point of view, numbers, what is market saturation? What does that look like?
Yeah, so in economics, we might talk about an equilibrium where, suddenly, supply and demand are equal, and, so one brewery coming in means another one has to go out. And I'll start by saying that I've been with the Brewers Association 6 years. I think for all of those 6 years, people have wondered, is this a bubble, and are we saturated? That was true when there were 3,000 breweries. It was true when there were 4,000. It's now true when there are 7,000.
Right.
Clearly, when we were at 3,000, it was not saturated. It was not a bubble.
Right.
We were doing just fine. And it's a hard question to answer because the market changes as well. What is saturation when we have 10% market share is different than if we can get to 15 or 20. And the Colorado market's growing too. We still get 100,000 people moving to Colorado every year. That's a lot of drinkers, a lot of people who are looking for, some of them are moving because they're excited about the Colorado beer scene. So it's not just to say we can take 400 breweries in Colorado, that's it, nobody else should open, because it is a moving target. So with those caveats, we're going to be the canaries in the coal mine. The flip side of being local and being so dense here is that there's so many breweries that we're going to be the ones who find out first whether you can throw in another 50 and people can close or they don't have to close, right?
Yeah, we still have a huge number of people moving into the area every month, right, into the Front Range between Colorado Springs and Fort Collins. But I also think some of it's a little bit like a Chicken Little problem, right? Like every time a brewery closes, it's like that's it. we're full. The market is saturated. And it's like, no.
4 more open the next week.
Yeah, like 4 more open the next week. Westward just released their article of, 10 breweries opening in the suburbs in 2019. And I think their article from November, breweries in 2019, wasn't even 10 breweries long. So it's like, I think it was 8. So now, it's still growing. We've got more openings than closings. So what does that opening closing rate look like in a saturated market?
Sure. In a saturated market, it would be equal. Nationally, we saw more than 1,000 openings and a little bit more than 200 closings. So, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. Colorado, it's more like 3 to 1. We saw, approximately 60 openings, approximately 20 closings last year. So Colorado certainly is closer to that saturation equilibrium point than nationally, but we're not there yet. And, I'm sure you guys know, you talk to people in the industry, there's plenty of people who are still looking to open that second location.
Oh, yeah.
Who, they see the demand for their products that they want to grow. So, right now it still feels like there's space. That point can switch real quick. You get another 50 breweries and that put a little more balance on one end of the scale on the supply side and the demand side doesn't go up enough and suddenly you're in trouble. But, right now I think there's still room to grow, but you gotta go to a new place. You gotta do something different. You gotta have a strong brand. Anybody who thinks they're going to come in right now and say, I'm a Colorado local brewery and I make an IPA and a Kolsch and they don't really stand out in the marketplace and this place isn't that interesting, they're not going to do very well in this market. So there's room, but it's a lot harder to find those little pockets than it used to be.
Yeah. Another question I had about growth. I'm sorry, I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit and getting my thoughts together. I am not an economist. Sometimes it's like my brain's still working on the last question while the current question is going. But I keep coming back to this number. 80% of growth occurring in the microbrewery sphere. That's still like a really small percentage of the volume of beer, even though like the BA represents. Like, does it? Looking at those numbers. Like, does that influence the BA and how sort of they're thinking? Does that make sense?
The BA is influenced by what our members want.
Sure.
So, we try to be whatever our members need at that particular time and moment in the industry. And certainly that does have to respond to changes in the market and growth. So, to give one real tangible example, we previously had 2 voting classes, production breweries and brew pubs. And production breweries, it didn't matter whether you were a little production brewery or a big one. Those were our classes. And we're carving out a new voting class, a taproom class, try to make sure that those smaller taproom breweries, which are really proliferated in recent years, have a voice, are getting resources, make sure that they have a seat on the board, that they're doing those types of things. So, in that regard, it focuses us on what we should be fighting for in terms of rights. If a lot of that growth is coming from direct, to consumer retail sales, you can better bet we're spending a lot of time and effort thinking about building arguments at the state level for why those are important, why those are critical, why that market access is going to keep breweries in business. So that's a long-winded way of saying,
sure.
We think about this growth, but, that's because of the needs of the breweries. And if that's the part that's growing, it also means that we should be focusing on the parts that aren't growing. How can we get those growing again? That's certainly part of where the independent craft brewer seal comes from. We know breweries who have broad distribution are struggling. They're fighting against the biggest beer companies in the world right now, and they're putting out products that look like they're local, even if they're scaled up and produced in breweries, halfway across the country. So those are the places where, both growth and slow growth really influence what we try to do to help all those small brewers grow in their markets.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, a really big challenge, because you have so many different classes of styles of business, size of business models, so many different types that make up the whole mosaic that is craft beer. And it's hard to make sure that everybody is getting equal representation or an equal say or can grow their business accordingly. A production brewery that's making over 15,000 barrels of beer a year has a much different problem than a tap room that's just starting to get going or starting to expand into off-premise sales. So it's such a diverse group of business types, I think, is kind of like my takeaway. Like the numbers, you really have to break them down and look at different categories to really get a snapshot of what you care about or what kind of information you want out of the numbers.
Yeah, 100% agree, and that's something I do every day. Let's look at tap rooms in this place versus production breweries in this place and break it down. But also say that when you're inward focusing, that's the case. But when you're outward focusing, I think there's still a lot that ties that community together. And one of the themes you're going to hear at CBC a lot, I think, is about unity and how, we're all still small brewers. We all still have a lot of the same technical challenges no matter what size you are, market challenges no matter what the size you are, and that there's a lot more that brings us together as brewers and as small brewers than some of those differences. So 100% agree on the analytics. I mean, that's what I do every day is try to figure out, how can I provide stats to give this little part of the market a competitive advantage.
Right.
But it's also worth remembering there's still big meta challenges. How do we grow, overall fuller flavored beer? 13% is a lot. We've grown a lot. There's still a lot of the beer market that's out there. There's a lot of wine and spirits that, we can tell people about, great beer and food pairing options and move them away from wine. I mean, there's lots of opportunities still to grow holistically, and I don't think we should lose sight of those just because there's differences in the business model between small brewers.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I was heartened the other day. I was speaking to some brewers at a big beer location, and they were having an issue, and I was like, I'm having this issue too. Like, we're having the same process issue. And it makes me, it's a little bit reassuring, right? If the scientists that are brewers are having the same issue as the former archaeologist that is now a brewer, there's a lot more carryover and crossover, I think, in that, especially in that realm, than a lot of people think. So, again, we're here with Bart Watson on BeerCraft, Colorado's craft beer show. We're live from the Studio Kitchen, Colorado, home of the Modern Eater Network. We're going to be talking on here for another 20, 30 minutes. But just a reminder, if you're watching us on Facebook, go ahead and throw up those questions, and we'll make sure to get them over to Bart or Jeff or myself.
Whoever the question's for. Maybe someone wants to ask Jay a question about video production. We can throw it at Jay and see if he's got a good answer. Who knows
absolutely.
Who's out there?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about the Colorado market and saturation. What does that look like? And but I'm curious, the Brewers Association is looking nationwide, so sort of what the nationwide market is looking like, and it's I suppose spoiler, if you were going to open a brewery in any state in the union right now,
where do you go?
Where do you go?
I'd probably go somewhere in the south or southeast. Those places have typically been a little bit behind. And are really starting to come online as great beer destinations. And it's not just those places. I mean, we've seen tons of growth in, say, New York in recent years. A lot of breweries popping up there. But Florida, Virginia, Georgia. A lot of this is legislative, that we saw rules get changed, so those brewers had more market access, and that's really spurred, the demand that was already there, because those brewers can now access the market in new ways. But, there's lots of parts of the country that don't have 400 breweries. I mean, there's lots of states that don't have as many breweries as Denver or Boulder County. With far bigger populations. So I think we still got a lot of run room nationally in a lot of these places, particularly in those small locally focused breweries that have been so popular all over the country. Yeah,
well, I think that's an important point too, that point you made about market access. Because I think, again, you're talking about Colorado or people who are sort of craft beer fans.
Fanatics.
People who, keep track of that kind of thing. There's craft beer everywhere. Right, but there is craft beer everywhere. I mean, I'm from Indiana originally, and just a few years ago they legalized tap rooms, and overnight Indiana became one of the fastest growing beer markets in the country. And Indiana, Michigan, that sort of Midwestern piece, and as a result, the quality of the beer just went up exponentially in a matter of months. And it was all about sort of having that market access and having that ability to go in and open up a tap room. And serve your beer to people. Instead, previously they were using festival tickets, right? Like those little red paper, go in, here's your 3 festival tickets.
We get so, you get so kind of spoiled and set in what you're used to, and that's just so outside the norm for this state. Kind of having a challenge getting beer. Like, beer is very accessible everywhere. Right. I grew up in New York, and I totally agree with you. It's amazing to see that rise in craft breweries in New York. I think I went back once, and I was like, a brewery here, and then it was Blue Point, which was a big brewery. They were purchased by Anheuser-Busch a while back, and that was kind of the craft brewery on Long Island where I grew up. And then there's 50 of them now between the boroughs of Manhattan and Long Island, and it's just every time you go back, people's like, oh, have you heard of this brewery? Have you heard of that brewery? So it is cool to see that process happening in more metro areas. Larger cities, and I was a little bit disappointed to find out that we don't have the most breweries within the city limits. Chicago won that this year.
Metro area.
And
that's defined very broadly. So, Chicago metro area is enormous.
It's practically like eastern Iowa now, I think.
Yeah, exactly. The Chicago metro extends from, it probably extends into 3 states. So, and a lot more people than the Denver metro. So,
right.
if you're creating a list of best places to drink beer in the country, Denver, Portland, San Diego, maybe you can throw, kind of the Grand Rapids, Michigan area in there too, Kalamazoo.
Yeah. And if you're not in one of those areas and you're watching the show, come on and prove us wrong.
Yeah, I mean, but that's kind of the short list. I get asked this question a lot, and there's lots of ways to do it. And, if you're going to focus on really small towns, there's tons of places that are making great beer around the country. But, I mean, those are kind of the epicenter still and the places where we really see the biggest concentrations.
Yeah.
Good spots to be a beer drinker.
Yeah, and I suppose the follow-up question to where is what, right? Is it a brew pub? Is it a tap room? Is it a nano? Is it a micro? Is it a regional player?
Yeah, Fort Collins produces more beer than Denver, even though it has a lot fewer breweries. So,
right.
I mean, how you cut this and how you look at it, I mean, you can come up with best lists for days. Maybe that'll be my next job. I'll just come up with, best lists of 10 best, and all be beer and brewing, and you could do that forever.
Yeah, that's true. And even like the fastest growing breweries, right? That's a cool list to have. It's interesting to see who's growing, but some players on there are like, it's kind of, you go from brewing 50 barrels a year to 700 and whatever, it's a 800 times increase. So it's, oh my God, it's like, it's a big growth, but still in the grand scheme of things, it's like small compared to millions of barrels a year.
Yeah, totally. And part of our role is to tell those stories. So, it's fun to create lists like that are a little bit different, that aren't just, who made the most beer, but, who had a different year, who changed things up, who grew. And, it's the breweries that go from the 3-barrel to the 10-barrel just as much as the breweries that went from the 50-barrel to the 150-barrel. Yeah. So, we like telling all those stories. And the fastest, 50, in some ways you can look at it and say, oh, most of these breweries are really small, but it's a fun way to tell some stories of breweries that don't get focused on, particularly in the national media as much.
Sure,
and,
yeah.
I always have fun with that one.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, I mean, speaking of kind of something that makes you different, I mean, we've been talking about beer a lot, but I think a big part of how much beer is selling is, or changing or growing or shrinking, might be what else consumers are gravitating towards. Because there's a lot of products out there. I mean, traditionally you kind of think about beer, you think about spirits, and you think about wine. But then there's kind of this big movement for low alcohol and non-alcoholic beer that's starting to uptrend. One article I was reading had a projection of an increase in 39% over a 5-year time period, which is pretty massive compared to 4% growth in the craft segment.
Yeah, and I think it was in Forbes, the Washington Post, and something like Budweiser has put all this money into like non-alcoholic in Western Europe, and like Miller Coors, Molson Coors is putting all this money into non-alcoholic in Canada, and this is where they're expecting this huge amount of growth.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there's other segments that it's interesting to kind of keep in mind. It's not only just beer, it's other segments, right? And we talked a little bit about kind of the demographics that consume that, and that's kind of shifted, which has shifted a general shift away from beer towards other beverages, right?
Yeah, we've certainly seen, beer has lost volume in recent years, and, some of that is things we've already talked about, aging population, price differences between wine and spirits. But, some of that is just people want different things over time. We see this, and when the Mad Men era, people drank a lot of cocktails. Then we really saw a golden era for, overall beer in the U.S. And, now we've seen that shift back, and we've seen a younger generation that drinks a little bit more wine and spirits. Brewers understand this as well. I mean, I think it's no secret why, things like barrel-aged beers are so popular. I mean, they blur those lines. That's what the consumer wants now. They don't think in occasions the way that, marketing companies do, that like, oh, we need to market beer to this occasion. They think about, flavors. They think about, this in a much more diverse way. And, we'll see where low alc plays in that. I'm a little bit less convinced than some. But, it certainly is big in Western Europe and other parts of the world. And, it might be something that we're going to see Gen Zers, the generation after millennials. Luckily, all the people who are tired of the millennials are articles. Get ready. They're going to be done, and we're going to start talking about Gen Zers are.
Let's push that to the next guys. I'm a little sick of that.
Yeah, and so, I mean, they may be totally different in what they like. Maybe they're going to like a ton of beer. Maybe they're only going to drink wine. Maybe they're going to mix their kombucha with hard seltzers. I don't know. And, trying to predict what the next generation of 21-plussers is going to do, unless you're one of those people, is really
this is a
hard.
question I have, too, when you're talking about generations now. And we don't have to get into it too much if we're tired, but it's like, how are millennials ruining beer right now? Right? That's the question. Because we know we are.
Let's make it a list. Top 10 ways millennials are ruining beer right now.
Yeah, that's good for the clickbait. So, yeah.
My favorite Millennials Are article recently was about how millennials that they surveyed in their 30s are drinking less than millennials in their 20s. And the meta headline is millennials aren't drinking. And it's like, yeah, people in their 30s drink less than people in their 20s. That's just called aging. That has nothing to do with being a millennial.
Yeah.
Aging proven through beer is what the headline should have read.
Yeah, so, millennials are, aren't drinking beer. They don't care about alcohol. And but luckily, they like a lot of craft. So, and actually, to move back to a little bit more serious note, I actually think there's a great opportunity for craft over the next decade. That, 25 to 34 has always kind of been, beer and craft sweet spot. But craft does really well in the next age bracket, 35 to 44. It's a little more sophisticated. People have a little more money in their pocket. They've got a job. And I think that's a place where craft can not just be part of the beer conversation, but part of the total beverage alcohol conversation.
Yeah, I think that. I tend to have a lot of conversations, talk to a lot of people about that. I think there's a huge potential for beer in the sort of high-end market, right? Have your red wine barrel-aged quad with your cigar, or have it as your aperitif instead of that, 2 fingers of whiskey or whatever. Yeah. Have it room temperature and uncarbonated, and it drinks like a brandy. And I feel like there's often some pushback there, like, beer it's the 24 to 35. It's the blue-collar beverage. I want to be able to drink 12 of them while I mow my grass and still mow a straight line. And
but beer is getting blurred in a lot of different ways, which I love. Like you're talking about the higher alcohol stuff, the aperitif stuff. We're working on a few projects now that are specific to that. We have a vermouth-inspired high-alcohol still beer in the works, and we have a Amaro-inspired barrel-aged beer in the works. Kind of higher alcohol, but really spice and botanical heavy. Yeah. And that's the kind of stuff that you maybe only want a 4-ounce pour of. You have it after a meal, and you're good. But I think you see that. You see cannabis-infused beers. You see a lot of this blurring the lines.
Yeah. Well, it's not just high-gravity beers necessarily, but, I mean, my point is to stand up on my soapbox for a minute. Like, the point really is, like, yeah, thank you.
Now I'm your height. No, hold on, now I'm lower.
Wine. Wine runs the full spectrum, right? From wine in a bag to $25,000 bottles of wine, right? Let beer also run the full spectrum, right? Let's get out of this idea that it's sort of truncated into certain experiences or certain kinds of drinking habits.
Yeah, 100% agree. And nothing pisses me off more than when you see like the threads on the online. How much will you pay for beer? And people will be like, oh, I'll never pay more than $25 for beer
because it's beer.
Yeah, because it's beer, and it is a beverage like many beverages. People will pay insane amounts for wine, and that doesn't mean you should be willing to pay that for every beer. But for that special occasion, why the hell not? And I would also say too, to the beer industry, speaking back to kind of the industry as opposed to the drinkers, the other parts of the alcohol industry are going to do this. You're already seeing this in spirits. They're putting things on tap. They're doing ready-to-drink cocktails.
Yeah.
They're coming for our occasions, and so the more we can come for their occasions and think, beer is a very versatile beverage. It can be high carb, low carb. It can be high ABV, low ABV. It has an incredible range of flavors. So there's no reason that brewers who have shown how innovative they can be can't find places where this beer is going to fit great in something where people only thought about cocktails before, or this is going to fit great in this wine pairing occasion. So I'm super excited about that. I'm super excited about beer wine hybrids, more barrel aging, the low end of the spectrum, not just the high, because I think there's a lot of places there too that beer just wins on beverage of moderation, a little bit lower alcohol. So there's a lot of great opportunities there.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about this because we've been talking about growth as like number of breweries, amount of beer sold, and now the more we kind of talk about it, there's a lot of expanse capacity for beer as a beverage of what it's defined as. So I think that could help increase the market capacity a little bit for it as it starts to expand into the low alcohol and expand into the high alcohol and expand into other beverage categories a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's something that often we don't have long conversations about. I mean, you look at the numbers, you say, oh, the numbers are growing, that's great, right? But something that you kept mentioning, Bart, is how do we keep growing the market share outside of that 13.2%? And I think, a lot of us just assume, well, we just keep making more beer. And it's like, well, no, we have to sort of create the occasions, like we were just talking about, to move beer into.
Yeah, if you think about that from a brewery perspective now, think about how many, different occasions there are in your day-to-day, and, how many of those you drink a beer in. And if you can really target in on the beer lover, why are they going to pick your beer in that occasion? There's still pockets of the market where I think, brewers can really own that space. And the brewers that have grown the biggest have often done that the most successfully. They've found a beer that really matches a particular time and place, and they've driven that marketing in that particular way. And, that's how you can be successful even when there's 7,000 breweries.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think the other part of that is kind of what we're seeing, we were talking about earlier. You're seeing beer, all this blurring of the lines. You're seeing the hard the hard seltzers, right? You're seeing, or all this talk about like CBD cannabis infused beers, which I think is really interesting. Yeah,
Which are still illegal, by the way.
yes,
Still federally legal, even if you use hemp as a derivative for CBD,
Yes.
according to TTB.
Yeah.
A lot of acronyms there, but can't do it.
Yeah. Still can't do it.
the short answer is yeah, you cannot do it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but there is, there are people who are kind of blurring those lines by removing the alcohol from the beer and then in an off-site location infusing it with even THC, which is interesting, and I'm curious on your thoughts about that. I think the cannabis industry is kind of seen as this big disruptor. It's this big untapped, black market industry that's getting legalized, and it's kind of burgeoning, and everyone's trying to do everything with the CBD, THC, all the things. How do you think that will affect the consumer? I mean, it's a beverage where people get a buzz, so it kind of connects to beer on that level. How do you see that kind of growing if things become federally legal and you're allowed to do it? How does that affect the consumer?
Yeah, and I'm glad you've already talked about a couple of things that I like to point out. That A, it's not a new market; it's a black market moving into a legal market. And B, this might be very different over time as it becomes federally legal. So, I'll start by saying, we spend a lot of time looking at this data to inform our members, and I don't see anything that tells me that it's driven beer sales down in the short term. Now, in the long term, I think it could be totally different. We're going to see how these companies innovate, how they push into new occasions. A de-alcoholized beer that has THC in it, that might fit in a beer occasion. That might pull some consumers away who, decide they don't want the beverage alcohol there, but they want something similar in terms of buzz. But there's going to be lots of interactions as well. One thing that people tend to forget is that the prices are going down really rapidly. So, one of the mechanisms where it might affect people is, well, if you're spending more money on legalized cannabis, you got less money to spend on beer. But what happens if the prices drop, as we've seen in almost every state where it's legalized? Then people who are already buying cannabis maybe have more money in their pocket for beer. So there's a lot of arrows that run in a lot of directions. I think in the long run it's naive to think that it won't have some effect. But many of the effects on brewers and their businesses might be things that aren't directly market share related. They might be, how do you train your taproom staff to see different types of intoxication?
Right.
They might be, how do you compete for warehouse space in Denver? I don't know if you guys have shopped for warehouses recently, but
nightmare.
Yeah,
It
a
gets
lot of
into,
that's about
the
cannabis
retail
grows.
level of the real estate market, and you're like, how am I supposed to have a
Exactly.
warehouse that I'm making beer at a low price point when it's being priced for a product that's like
well, yeah, and I think it's
three
our. I
times
mean,
the value.
the Intrepid Sojourner is right across the street from a dispensary. I mean, we routinely deal with have our staff has to deal with people coming in stoned.
Yeah.
And how do you handle that situation?
But there may be opportunities as well. We see breweries do in states where it's legal. Cannabis and beer pairings. Which ones pair the best? Maybe that's a new occasion that doesn't exist, but when it's federally legal, it can, and
if
that's
you
an
can-
opportunity for beer.
If you can remember all the pairings by the end, then you get a special prize to take home with you.
I'm not recommending this, but I'm just saying. I think people tend to think of this as, oh, cannabis is coming, it's all going to be bad, and that there's a lot of interactions. There may be opportunities. And so far, the data suggests this isn't, the Armageddon where everybody's now going to only smoke weed and we're not going to have any beer anymore.
All right. So winter is not coming for us in the CBD and cannabis
Well, I think,
approaching beer.
and that's just an important point. It's not like people weren't smoking weed before.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the whole black market moving into a legal market. I mean, people have been doing it.
Yeah,
Beer is still doing all right.
I'll get geeky economist for a second. Very hard to estimate what the actual demand growth is, but some of the studies have suggested we're seeing 5 to 8% demand growth right now for cannabis. But based on the price decreases, that might mean the actual amount being spent on cannabis is actually going down. So we'll see what that looks like long run. As there's new products, CBD is a whole nother world that might change. I think it probably will change. We see that people are more interested in products as there's more diversity of products. That's kind of true in any consumer product good. And there's already this proliferation of edibles, of vaping, of oils, of tinctures, of all sorts of things. So I do think the demand for it's going to grow, but so far it hasn't been as big as I think some people see. When they see those tax numbers, they're like, wow, look at all this cannabis people are buying. And they forget a lot of those people were buying a lot of cannabis before.
Yeah. Now we're just recording it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now the
Keep tabs
tax
on it.
man is
Tax
keeping
man's
track.
keeping track.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Long overdue.
Yeah.
Well,
So we're getting close. We're getting close to the end of our hour here on Beercraft. So I think it's probably a good idea to take a few minutes and look at Bart's crystal ball
yes.
and talk about sort of based on the trends that he's seen over the last couple of years. Now that he's been doing this with the Brewers Association for 6 years, what do the next 6 years look like?
Do economists
for
like
brewers?
being asked to predict the future as much as everyone else does?
Probably less so because we know we're
Yeah.
going to be wrong. Like, you know,
How wrong are you going to
yeah,
be?
exactly.
Where's
So
your
right
margin?
now I'm thinking in error terms, like
Right.
you know,
Where are my bars?
yeah, exactly.
We are going to play this episode back to you in 6 years.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So-
Yeah,
yeah.
I expect this. You know, we'll see what it looks like. You know, I think that this year is probably pretty indicative of what we saw in 2018 and what we're going to see for the next period of time. There's going to be growth. It's going to be slow growth. It's going to get split up a lot. People are still excited about opening and running breweries. 10,000 breweries in the country, probably. You know, we have more than 10,000 federal licenses right now, so a lot of breweries are coming. And it's going to get tougher and tougher out there. And the breweries that, you know, figure out those places where they found their market niche, where they up their game in, you know, marketing and experience, where they really, you know, think about this more holistically as not just, you know, why do I stand out in the beer market, but why do I stand out in this set of experiences and this set of, you know, beverage alcohol choices that consumers have. And there's going to be more local distilleries and more local wineries too. And we're seeing those license numbers go up. So, you know, a world where craft has 15 share, but it's now split amongst, you know, 10,000 breweries. I mean, I think that's pretty probable.
Yeah. I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see. I think, you know, to use a non-economics metaphor, right? It's the rising tide floats all ships, right? I mean, one of the things I'm constantly blown away with in a market like Colorado is just the level of knowledge and camaraderie. Like, because brewers are expected to brew everything the first time really well, right? And I think anytime you go into a market that's growing and you've got all these brewers coming into all these breweries opening in the market, the quality always just
Yeah, I mean,
goes up.
Quality goes up, and I love it too because if you think about just beverages and alcoholic beverages as a whole, you're going to start getting more craft where you maybe had commodity items before. It's going to shift back away from this kind of industrialized version of food and beverage products back to local, back to artisanal, someone who cares about what they're doing, who's trying to get the best flavor and best quality out across the board. You know, it kind of happened with coffee. We were talking about that earlier. Kombucha, cider, wine, distilling, brewing, non-alcoholic beverages, seltzer, ciders, like all this stuff is going to really increase in quality, which is a pretty exciting time to be a consumer of food and beverage, I think, if you just like good food and beverage.
Yeah, and it's just, I think, generally like a forced creativity, right? As we have to move into those spaces and be successful in the way that Bart is talking about, it's going to require people innovate and create new kinds of beer, continue blurring those lines, and I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, me too.
So next week we'll be exploring more about where it goes. We'll be live again at Former Saint from Craft Brewers Conference. So stay tuned for more information on that. We'll be talking about craft beer in the U.S. and where it's come from and where it's going the whole month of April. So I want to thank Bart Watson from the Brewers Association for
Thanks for having me.
making the trek down to Studio Kitchen, Colorado. And
Yeah, join us next week. Like we said, lots of really interesting brewers from all over the country will get their firsthand experience. We'll see if it lines up with what Bart's telling us, and if it doesn't, we'll have them back on and we'll hash it out. It'll be fun.
all right, we'll see you next week.